Welcome to the Business of Thinking podcast. This is the place for high achievers who want more than motivation. They want mastery. Here we skip the surface level talk and go straight into the psychology of high performance.
Hello and welcome to the Business of Thinking. My name is Reid and today I'm delighted to be joined by Roger Steare. And Roger is what is known as a corporate philosopher. Welcome, Roger. What is a corporate philosopher and how did you get into that?
Hello, Richard. Thank you very much for inviting me into your podcast. So the original title was actually given to me by the dean of what was Cass Business School, now Bayes Business School in the City of London. And I was working with them and helping all of their teaching faculty incorporate ethical thinking within every one of their 30 plus undergraduate and postgraduate courses. And he decided me to call me corporate philosopher in residence, or the corporate philosopher at the business school. So that's how the title started. So I didn't invent it, he invented it, but obviously I've used it shamelessly since, because most people think it's so cool and they say, how do I become a corporate philosopher? And I said, well, I don't know. Anyway, so that's how the title stuck. But I can, looking back at my life, there are just a handful of really important influences on how I arrived here. So my journey started obviously with my family, and my father, who was a builder during the week. He ran a small construction company. But on a Sunday, he was a Methodist preacher. And Methodist chapels at the time, some of them had, 3 people in the congregation. So the whole family used to turn up and double or triple the size of the congregation. But one of the things, other than obviously a literal Protestant work ethic, one of the things he taught me was obviously the difference between right and wrong. But he also taught me how to engage people in conversation. So in his sermons, he always used a prop to make a point about something or to introduce it. So he introduced me to storytelling. The next critical moment was reading the history of Western philosophy at university, not with Bertrand Russell, I'm not that old, but with his son, Lord Conrad Russell. And that was a critical moment, and I absolutely loved that, not least because when I had to critique his father's history of Western philosophy, I was very honest in my critique. So there are bits of it I really liked and other bits that I wasn't so sure about. And I remember him saying to me in that tutorial, Roger, I think your critique is fair, because my father wrote that book in 6 months in order to pay off his creditors. And it just shows you that the story behind, a book written by one of the world's, greatest modern philosophers had that sort of very ordinary story behind it. So that was important. When I left university, I went boring and became a banker in the city, and banking should be boring because when it gets exciting, people tend to lose a lot of money. And I got bored very quickly. So I dropped out and became a residential social worker with teenagers in care who couldn't be handled by children's homes. Not so difficult that they had to be locked away, but presenting lots of difficult behaviors, and we're obviously suffering a lot through deep and persistent trauma. So that was what I call my MBA in life. And it taught me, I think, one of my core moral values and beliefs, which is a combination of 2 words. The second word is love. So love in terms of agape and philos, kindness, if you like, compassion, is the most powerful force in the world. Einstein said words to that effect. But the first word is tough. And tough doesn't mean horrible. It means being resilient and never giving up, but being ready to, bend in the wind a bit, but never actually breaking. So that really taught me tough love as my operating system as an individual. So that was very important. Then as a social worker, I wasn't really earning much money, couldn't really afford a mortgage. So I thought I'd go back into banking, and ended up joining one of the city's most prestigious headhunting and recruitment businesses, where I eventually became CEO. And people made a joke about the fact that that part of my career combined my knowledge of banking with delinquency. But I think what made me successful was that I was very good at matching people's character to the culture of the firms and the character of their manager going forward. So that, I think, was really interesting. I eventually became CEO of the business, which had been acquired by Adecco, the world's largest employment agency. So I got a lot of experience there running a subsidiary of a global multinational, which was another practical MBA. But I had a fundamental disagreement with the group CEO. Obviously, I left, he didn't. And I started doing some coaching because people said I was a very good coach, a leader as a coach. And the final part of the story, which takes us to 20 years ago, was working with a very dear friend of mine who was a Benedictine abbot, where we found ourselves writing a paper for the Financial Services Authority, as it then was called, on defining the word integrity for people who work in financial services. And that then led to me writing my book, Ethicability, which is 20 years in production next year. And also developing the moral DNA profile, which assesses how we choose to make difficult decisions. So I'm sorry if that was a bit of a long answer, but there's quite a lot to pack in.
Absolutely, I love the variety in there. There's elements of religion, and you've got the sort of the social work, and then the banking. I guess often we think about banking, we think about ethics, and often lack of ethics, whether that's fair or not. And there's something interesting that we spoke about when we met prior to this recording. We spoke about an analogy that you use about traffic lights and roundabouts. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite, and people often struggle to understand philosophical concepts and thinking concepts. And that's because philosophers love using really long words because it makes them look really clever. I mean, they may be clever, but if you're really, really clever, you'll use language that people can readily understand.
Yeah.
So the concept of the traffic light and the roundabout, and there's a third one. So there's 3 traffic signs.
Okay.
Which enable us to make good decisions in our lives, either on our own or together. So the roundabout is when we see the roundabout sign, we have to make a judgment as to when we join the stream of traffic safely in order to get to the right exit. So that's judgment or reason or logic, as I call it. So let's use the word logic. We're making a rational decision. The traffic light is you just have to obey. You have to do as you're told. So that I call the law. And obviously we know that when we see a green light, we can go. When we see a red light, we stop. When we see an amber light, we go really, really fast in order to get through until the red light comes on. The third traffic sign, which is probably the most powerful, is the pedestrian crossing sign. So the pedestrian crossing sign invites us to literally think about the impact of our actions on other people. So if the roundabout stands for logic, the traffic light stands for law, when we are confronted with the possibility of hurting someone or allowing someone to cross, that's the traffic sign I call love. And if you like, at the heart of the way I've translated moral philosophy, religion, and rooted it all in modern sciences like neuroscience, psychology, which is where you work, and in anthropology, which is really, really important. Those three strands of our moral DNA can be found and grounded in all of those humanities and social sciences.
I think it's a fantastic analogy. And how do you see that play out in the kind of organisations that you work with, and what are the potential setbacks with some of those?
Yeah, so there's a very clear problem with the way that organisations try to get people to think and make decisions. So in our personal lives, those three lenses or voices, as I call them, the voice of love, logic, and law, should all be paid equal attention.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But what happens when we go to work, and this is something we've measured through 170,000 moral DNA profiles, is that our, if you like, the preference or bias for the law, which is all around compliance and rules and processes and systems, goes through the roof. It dominates our thinking at the expense of love and concern for colleagues, customers, clients, and communities. And the other thing you get is, there's a lot of research out there into these things called codes of conduct and codes of ethics. They are mostly useless. So I've been looking at one professional code. I won't say where it is because I don't want to embarrass them. But it's a 200-page document drafted by lawyers as a defense against litigation in case any one of these professionals does something wrong. But it doesn't contain any effective decision-making framework, and it doesn't invite people to think in very simple language like, so the love voice asks us, how could I help or harm other people by my decision? Very simple question. The logic voice says, are you thinking clearly about this? Have you got all the relevant facts you need in order to make a decision? And the law doesn't say go and read a 200-page code of conduct. It actually asks us, are we fulfilling our legal rights, responsibilities, promises made to others? Those, if you like, in anthropological, sociological terms, are the norms and taboos of behavior, the things we should do and should not do, which are in effect an output from thinking through love and logic. So law is, if you like, our collective historic memory of what billions of people over 200,000 years have worked out is the right thing to do in most situations. So another long answer to your question, most business leaders and regulators get this so wrong, which is why there's so much wrongdoing still happening, because they are relying on traffic lights instead of using roundabouts and pedestrian crossing signs.
Yeah. And I guess an obvious example of an industry that had a reset is the banking industry, isn't it, after the 2008 crisis? How has this played out? Have there been improvements there, or are we seeing some of the issues that you've referred to?
Well, here's how I think about it, Richard. I've worked with some big name brands, big name banks. I'm not going to name any now, but it's easy to discover who I've worked with. And I cannot work with an inanimate legal concept called a corporation. It is a legal person. It can own property. It can enter into contracts. It can sue and be sued. But it has no personality. It has no body and no physical body, and it has no moral agency. So I don't work with companies. I work with people who are employed by these companies. And I would say most of the people I've worked with understand what I'm talking about, agree with it, and try to do their best. And that, insofar as it goes, has been successful. But has my work had any lasting impact on the system? I have no idea. The fact is, we still have fundamental structural problems, not just in our economic models, but also in our social models. And what I mean by that is that our economics, traditional classical economic theory, deliberately puts off balance sheet and externalizes the costs of the sort of things that are killing us at the moment. So pollution, the burning of fossil fuels, the heating of the planet, etc., the way that we're creating addictive, hyper, ultra processed foods mean that we've got this combination of environmental collapse, physical ill health, and because everyone's addicted to having more, if you don't have enough or you can't get more, it's creating social and political unrest, and it's creating anger and tension between communities. So everything that's happening right well in terms of the polycrisis we're facing now around the environment, social tensions, political tensions, religious strife, is all to do with the fact, in my humble opinion, is to do with the fact that our economic model is based on the assumption that if we have everything we want, then we're all going to be happy. And that is actually completely back to front. Trying to have everything we want just actually makes us unsatisfied and unhappy. But if we can meet our legitimate needs for a decent life, there is more than enough to go around. More than enough. So, so that's another long answer to your question. I actually do not believe that things are going to be better until they get a lot worse, and thus ordinary everyday people start to say this cannot go on. I mean, just next door to us in Tunbridge Wells in the last 2 weeks, they've had their water cut off because it was contaminated. The local reprocessing plant failed. And then when it was switched back on again, everybody had to boil their water. Well, I've said to my wife on many occasions, I said it a lot during COVID and lockdown, I don't think things are going to change in our society until ordinary people and perhaps middle class and wealthy people have to queue for basics in supermarkets or next to, water tankers dispensing, water to us, and our drains not, when that happens, we'll all wake up. But it's not necessary. Just want people to wake up and stop and think about these things. Anyway, it's turning into a bit of a rant, Richard. I'm sorry about that.
No, I love it, but I guess it's quite a sad proposition, isn't it? That we've got to go to those extremes for people to sit up and listen. And it sounds as though, in the meantime, it's heavily reliant upon individuals with goodwill and tenacity within organisations to try and make that change. Well, are there any ways that we can preempt those sort of extreme circumstances? Is there anything more that organisations or individuals in those organisations can be doing?
Well, let's not start with organisations. You've already worked out I have a pretty low opinion of the Joint Stock Corporation as a form of human community. I mean, it's not difficult for people to find out the origin of the Joint Stock Corporation. In its modern form, it's the East India Company, which was first formed in the year 1600 and had a license from the Crown, from the government, to effectively rape and pillage, literally, the world east of Egypt, the Middle East. And it is not democratic. So how many people listening to this, if they're at work, get to elect their manager, let alone their CEO and board? It is a post-medieval feudal construct. It is, in technical terms, in political philosophy terms, it's a plutocracy, not a democracy. A plutocracy is where power comes from money. So in other words, the people who own the stock, which has monetary value, are the people who ultimately make the decisions. The only way that only times democracy works is when you decide to join that community and then to resign and leave it. That's the only time that works. So I said, let's not start with the organization. We need to start with our civic communities, and we need to go right down to family life. And there are people more expert than me on how you build a thriving, safe, happy life. And then to a wider community, the model is friendship and neighborhood. And people may be aware of the Harvard study on adult development, which is the longest running study into answering the question, what makes us happy and healthy? It's been running since 1938. It's one of the pieces of evidence I talk about a lot. And there's one simple answer, which is, if you want to live a long and happy life, you don't need more stuff. You don't need more money. You need warm relationships with other people, warm, genuine, caring relationships with others. That's it. End of. The evidence is overwhelming. And you'll know that from your...
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting, sort of the entry point to this conversation. You touched on various influences from religion, and I guess as you're talking, I'm thinking that some of these problems have probably come about as we've moved away from having those foundations of religion. It's not to say that religion is necessarily what we all need.
Yeah.
It's some of the principles that it expounds.
Yeah, that's a good point, Richard. And I would say is you don't need to be religious, but you do need to have a moral philosophy. So Buddhism is not a religion, it's a philosophy. Humanism, by definition, is not a religion, it's a philosophy. And you don't have to sign up to any one of those. What we can all do is say, this is my belief system. This is the sort of person I want to be, because I want everyone to be like this. And if everyone was like this, then the world would be a better place. So that's the point about religion and philosophy. And you don't have to sign up to be a member of any club or tribe. You just have to have a coherent philosophy on life and what it means to be human. So we need to reestablish and understand and relearn what it means to be a loving, caring member of a family, friendship, neighborhood community. That needs to be taught at schools. It's not really happening in the UK, in my view. Our grandchildren are in the Netherlands, and they don't teach any formal lessons until they're 7 years old. From the ages of 4 to 7, they just learn to build social skills and relationships through play. And in fact, they also learn to do other things through play. And we've got the most corrosive, ineffective, in fact, dangerous education system that I think you can have. And it's designed not to educate people. It's designed to turn people into economic entities whose purpose in life is to make crap for other people to buy and sell and then chuck into a recycling bin in a year. I mean,
it perpetuates that model, doesn't it?
It does.
It doesn't teach people emotional intelligence. It doesn't teach them how to form effective relationships or any of those things. Yeah,
absolutely. So we need reform we need to ask ourselves, what is it we need to do for our children? We clearly need to educate them, but we're not. We're actually converting them into these economic units, and we measure whether or not we're prosperous or not on the basis of whether our economy is growing. And the ethos of growth for its own sake is the same ethos as the malignant cancer cell. So we've got a cancerous economic system, which is why we've got an environment that's quickly deteriorating, and why we as individuals and communities are so unhealthy, both physically and mentally. So that's, I think, is really, really important. And we also need to reform our political systems so that we elect people who are qualified to do the job. At the moment, our politicians are not qualified to do the job because the way that they're selected is, it looks like democracy, but we don't actually look to vet as to whether or not they're technically capable of running, for example, the Ministry of Justice or being Prime Minister, and so on and so forth. So we get all these people who may be lawyers in terms of their background or engineers or whatever, and that's fine. But we don't have a postgraduate course to run a ministry. We've got a civil service, but they just get told what to do by ministers who are not qualified to make those judgments. Another way of doing it is actually to do what they've done in Ireland, for example, which is to have citizen assemblies who make big decisions on things like, should we now legalize abortion?
Yeah.
And that was a very smart move by the government because they were afraid of tackling the Irish Catholic Church on that one. So they said, we're going to duck this one and we're going to form a citizens' assembly who spent a period of time, so about 150 people, I think it was, spent some time examining evidence, real facts, not fake news, but real facts and evidence from experts about, fancy that. And then came up with a recommendation with, the workings and the footnotes behind it, which was then put to a referendum, and the Irish people decided by a supermajority, over 2/3 voted to legalize abortion. Now, I'm not saying you ought to do that on every little thing, but that's a way for us to start deciding things like, how much of our taxes should we be spending on X, Y, or Z, and giving people a chance to say, well, actually, we don't want to spend £100 billion on a high-speed rail network when most of us spend our lives online. We don't need to spend 100 billion plus on a nuclear deterrent. All of these things, we do need to be spending more on preventative healthcare. We do need to be, looking at the foods that we're buying, and to make sure they're not poisonous and they're actually healthy for us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's the sort of thing that deep thinking, critical thinking, and moral philosophy can bring us in terms of tackling what's really going on in the world at every level.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I didn't realise before this conversation how many different facets of life this touches on, but it's pretty much all encompassing, isn't it?
It is, and it's interesting. I about 20 years ago, I was working with a psychologist who had been given a psychometric test, which analyzes how any individual processes information and learns. And it uses a whole range of things, so words, symbols, all of this stuff, hand-eye coordination, and so on and so forth. So I was a guinea pig for that. And so I did the test, and it came back from the developers and said, well, can you ask Roger to do it again? Because we've got a very weird result. And so I did it again, and it came back with another weird result. And the result is that my thinking style is holistic and synthetic. In other words, I synthesize. So in other words, I'm a jack of all trades and probably master of none, which means I am endlessly curious in everything. So everything from psychology, anthropology, quantum physics, food science, everything that we should know about, I'm constantly interested in. And what my mind does is to try and spot patterns that are consistent across those, which is why my work, as I said earlier, is based not just on philosophy, but religious traditions, political beliefs, anthropology, psychology, and neuroscience.
And I'm just sort of reflecting on some of the things that you said. You've put love, you've put people at the centre of this. What are your thoughts on AI? It seems like we're at the thin end of the wedge with AI, and it's only going to become more prominent.
Yeah.
Based on what you said, I've got a few concerns, but I'm interested to hear what you think.
So, okay, AI is not one thing. We've had artificial intelligence and algorithms since the 1950s. What broke through in 2022 was ChatGPT, which is a large language model. And it was large language models, as the name suggests, were originally designed to translate from one language to another. So it meant that you and I could be talking and our earphones would be translating. So if I was speaking French and you were speaking Spanish, we could have an almost instantaneous conversation.
Yeah.
The mathematics behind large language models means that it is not exact, it's probabilistic, because language is probabilistic. It's not Newtonian in terms of it's either yes or no. And therefore it hallucinates because it's only predicting through the use of tokens. Right. So, and it does this incredibly fast, but it basically says, okay, if I've got the first letter of a word and it's a T, the most likely next letter is an H. And then if it's 3-letter word, it's going to be an E. And then after THE in this context, the next word is likely to be X, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a form of randomness in there, but also probabilistic, which means that you can end up getting just rubbish out of it. I mean, when I first started playing with ChatGPT, it said I was born in Singapore. I mean, where did that come from?
I'm assuming that's not true.
It's not true. And I've worked in Singapore, and it's a fascinating place to visit. That's the problem. We've got the problem, which are like these large language models, which are now not only creating content, word content, they're creating imagery and video and so on and so forth. It's full of errors, and it can also be misused by bad actors. So there are two problems there. One is on the quality of the product and the reliability of the product, and then the fact that it's being misused by people. So the misuse is very dangerous because in several ways it's actually killing creativity. I have to be careful when I write. I do use AIs to help stimulate my thinking, and it's like having an editor next to you. And I sometimes use one to make my language more accessible to a teenager.
Yeah.
Because I believe we need to be speaking in very plain language and so on. So I do use it, and I disclose that I use it in those ways. But if I was to ask it to write my next book, it would just be rubbish. And no one should buy it if that happened. And it completely degrades the value of what we're doing. However, if we use it as a tool, and remember there are other AI applications which are incredibly capable. So an obvious one are an AI's ability to scan MRI scans and detect breast cancers at very early stages. And when it thinks it's got a positive, which is you don't want because it says it's an early stage tumor, it then sends that to a human oncologist who will then have a look themselves and then do a biopsy.
Yeah.
It can process thousands of those MRI scans 24/7, 365, never get tired. That is a worthy use of artificial intelligence. But it's not a large language model. There are many other uses. But one of the problems we've got is people don't understand what AIs are, their capacity for helping us, which they do, but also an immense capacity to harm us. And AI plus social media are what I call weapons of mass deception. They are creating conflict, tensions, misunderstandings, and so on at scale, at speed. And it is bad. That combination is really, really bad. And I worry about it. And I've got my own podcast called Chat Rog, where I've interviewed quite a lot of experts in designing smartphones and software that prevent under 16-year-olds using smartphones, which have otherwise the capability to deliver a frame, instructions on how to kill yourself, or deliver you the most appalling pornography, enable you to take inappropriate pictures of yourself and share them with your school friends. I mean, this is a sort of shit, excuse my language, which is going on at the moment, and it's appalling.
Yeah.
And I actually admire the
therapy room
Australian
every week.
government.
Yeah.
And I admire the Australian government, which has now banned
Big
smartphones
step,
for 16-year-olds, and they're all having to come off these, the social media sites, which are sucking the life out of them. So that's again a very long answer to your question about AI. And I'll try and get it out. I use the analogy of a knife. So anyone who's watching the video version of this, that is a Neolithic flint knife blade.
Oh, really?
It's about 5,000 years old.
Wow. Did you find that?
No, I bought it on eBay from a reputable source.
Okay.
And I use the knife as an analogy for any cutting edge technology. Boom. And the knife was designed to kill. In other words, to kill a prey that we would then use another knife to skin and cut up. And then we'd use another technology called fire to cook it.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with the knife. There's nothing wrong with fire, but used by the wrong people in the wrong way, they can kill and hurt us. All technology is the same. And that's what people have got to remember, and not be sucked in by these firms who are actually more interested in making money for very wealthy people whose, for them, any more money doesn't make them any happier whatsoever. I mean, when you're a billionaire, having another billion doesn't make a big difference to your life. In fact, we know from the research on income that in the UK, for example, earning more than 2 or 3 times the national average wage is about 35,000. So between 70 and just over 100,000. Once you go over that, your level of happiness and contentment and quality of life does not increase. So why is everyone trying to win the lottery and get £10 million? It's not going to make you happier, but the research shows it will probably make you deeply unhappy.
I'm just conscious of time. So we've got our general audience is business people, entrepreneurs. Any words of advice for them in terms of prompting them to make changes that might contribute towards some of the positives that you mentioned?
Yeah, and look, they're very simple, really, because I've been trying to work this out for 67 years. Well, I can only remember when I was 3, so 64 years.
Okay, good.
And I've had the privilege of the last 20 plus years working with lots and lots of people at work, many of them leaders, but many of them followers. And my invitation and ask is that people just stop and think and engage their emotional brain as well. And remember the fact that these very simple but powerful voices in our heads can help us make better decisions. And we've proved it over thousands of years. Those three very simple words and voices in our minds are love. So in other words, ask yourself the question, is the thing I'm thinking of doing next, is it going to help or harm people? And sometimes it does both, but can I mitigate the harms to the people when I can't avoid it? So that's the first one. That's the first voice. The second voice is to remember the power of critical thinking, which begins with questioning assumptions, making sure that you've got enough clear evidence and data to make your decision. And it has to be as complete as possible. So a lot of the stuff when I'm working with boards and executive teams, they sweating over spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations and data. but they're drowning in it, and they're not beginning the process by asking the right question. They're just using the data that's easy to gather and not gathering the insights they need to gather. And then you need to have a rational discussion. And in order to have that rational discussion, you need to be able to interrogate it as you would in a college debating society. So that means that just because you've got the biggest job title and you earn the most money, you should not be speaking most of the time. You should be listening most of the time and inviting colleagues to actually express opinions that may not be in line with your own.
Yeah.
So that critical thinking, that constructive dissent, as one of my CEO clients calls it, is absolutely critical. So that's the logic lens. The third one, which is law, which is on steroids in business. And I'm not just talking about regulation, I'm talking about internal compliance processes. It does not make you safer. It actually increases risk. And I translate law into understanding our responsibilities, the promises we make, being honest, and ensuring that the basic norms and taboos of any functioning human community are reflected in the decisions we make. So it's about rights and responsibilities and the promises we make. So those are the three simple things. I go into it in a bit more detail in my book, Ethicability, which has been in print since 2006. So it's just come up for its 20th anniversary. I've only printed 25,000 copies, but employers have bought licenses for their firms, and the current count is approaching 700,000 digital copies. So as a self-published non-fiction book, it's doing pretty well.
That's not bad
and that's because that's because it works. It's not because I'm necessarily a brilliant author. It's just that alongside the way that I explain things in conferences, offsites, team meetings, and so on, it really helps people. And the final practical thing you can do is search for moraldna.org. And there's a free version of our psychometric, which assesses how you make decisions using those lenses. I think there we call them people, values, and rules. So how does it affect other people? You have to think about your values, and then you have to comply with good, simple norms and taboos of behavior. So those are the practical things, and recognize that decision-making, social decision-making, is the thing that's most important in businesses. It happens in these things called meetings. The more senior you are, the more you are a professional meeting attender, either virtual, hybrid, or in person. And I would advise you to hone your skills at leading those critical thinking activities, but make sure that people bring their heart as well as their head into the room, and consider the impact of every decision you make on other people. Because if we don't do that better, then, okay, we might not think we've got too much level. If you're more senior, probably later in life, but do you not care about the future for your children and your grandchildren? Because if we're not, we're committing generational child abuse and neglect. And it is appalling. So if you want a very clear emotional and moral argument and logical argument for doing more of the right thing, that's it. If you don't care about your children and your grandchildren and other people's children or grandchildren, you're just a psychopath. And I'm very sorry for you. I can't help you, but a clinical psychologist might be able to help you.
Roger, powerful words there, and certainly left me with lots to reflect on. Any final words before we wrap up today's conversation?
Yeah, I think the final thing I say is that everything I've been talking about, I hope, comes across as actually quite simple but hard. So I think truths in life are simple and hard. A 200-page code of conduct is both hard and complex. and it completely useless in my view. But if you can really focus on the decisions we make and their impact on people, that's the love thing. The values we use in complex decision making, critical thinking, that's the logic lens or voice. And then the final one, make sure we stick to our promises and discharge our responsibilities. And remember the spirit behind the law, rule, or regulation, not just the letter of it, and try and find a really clever way of doing what we want, but not caring about the consequences for other people. And as a leader, if you're a leader listening to this, then lead with integrity. According to a recent FT survey, 76% of people today want to work for ethical leaders. And I'm sure most of you are ethical people, but make sure you bring that leader, that ethical leader, that person of integrity and character into your work. Don't leave it at home with the kids, the dog, your partner, whatever it is. Bring that person into the office, onto that Zoom call, and remember that, we all have a legacy that we're going to leave for people, and ask yourself, how do I want to be remembered? And if you want some inspiration, go to your local cemetery or graveyard and look at the word that dominates every tombstone, and that is the word love.
Roger Steare, corporate philosopher, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Richard. I've really loved talking with you about it. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you.
This is the business of thinking. Mastery doesn't end here. See you in the next episode.